Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into an absolutely fascinating breakdown by industry insider Natrian Maxwell. We're going to explore how the entire structure of the modern digital advertising business, literally the ecosystem we're all swimming in today, wasn't slowly built over decades. No, as the title suggests, the foundation was poured and set in a single, shockingly short window almost 20 years ago. I absolutely love getting into the structural why behind this complex industry, and by the end of this explainer, you're going to see the digital ad world in a completely different light.
Okay, let's dive into this. And honestly, there's no better place to start than right here, $11 billion. Back in the spring and summer of 2007, five massive players, Google, Microsoft, Yahoo, AOL, and WPP, dropped roughly $11 billion. By the end of that year, almost every independent ad tech asset of any real scale had been scooped up and pulled inside one of these five companies. They bought the pipes, they bought the auctions, and they basically set the stage for the whole agency versus platform tension we're still dealing with today.
But here's the part that's truly mind-blowing to me. They didn't spend that $11 billion over 5 years, or even 2 years. They dropped it all in just 90 days. Between April and July of 2007, an entire global industry just restructured itself. It's an insanely short window. The foundational plumbing of modern ad tech was effectively poured and set in just 3 months. To really get how the internet works today, we have to understand exactly what happened in those 90 days.
So, part 1, Google sparks the stampede.
You know, you don't get an $11 billion buying frenzy without a huge catalyst. And on April 13th, 2007, we got one. Google announced it was buying DoubleClick for $3.1 billion in cash. Now, we've got to remember what Google was at that exact moment in time. They were this incredibly profitable search advertising machine, but they had almost nothing else. They had effectively zero presence in display advertising, no premium ad servers, no exchange where ad inventory gets auctioned. DoubleClick perfectly provided all of that plumbing in a single stroke, including this little asset called the DoubleClick Ad Exchange, which, as we know, became incredibly important later on.
And this brilliantly illustrates how incredibly fast everyone else moved the second Google tipped its hand. Looking at this timeline from April to July 2007, the source points out this wasn't some slow, calculated competitive response. It was a total stampede. Imagine your biggest rival going from literally zero display presence to becoming the undeniable space leader in a single quarter. The rest of the market absolutely scrambled.
Which brings us to part 2. 4 panic-driven billion-dollar bets. That initial scramble kicked off absolute chaos. Look at the scorecard. These were 5 massive companies operating 5 very distinct engines, making 5 totally different bets about where the real value in advertising would eventually end up. You've got Google's initial deal at the top, right? But then look at the reactions from Microsoft, Yahoo, WPP, and AOL. Every single one of them reached for an acquisition target, throwing hundreds of millions, and in Microsoft's case, billions, onto the table just to lock down their own piece of the infrastructure.
Just 5 weeks after Google's move, Microsoft comes out and announces they're buying Aquantive for a staggering $6 billion. They paid an 85% premium. At the time, that was one of the largest in tech M&A history. And why? Well, it wasn't because they had some brilliant display advertising strategy all mapped out. They did it because they panicked. Microsoft simply couldn't stomach the idea of Google owning both search and display advertising uncontested. It was a $6 billion insurance policy, and it was priced exactly like one. Then you have this fascinating outsider move by WPP, the British agency holding company. They didn't come from the tech platform world at all. Under Sir Martin Sorrell, WPP bought 24/7 Real Media for $649 million. Sorrell deduced that if these tech platforms ended up owning all the ad-serving infrastructure, the traditional ad agencies were eventually going to get completely cut out of their own clients' media budgets. It was a purely defensive move just to protect the whole agency model.
Let's move to part 3 and see how this builds into the aftermath, the winners and the losers.
Making a billion-dollar bet is one thing, right? But actually operating that asset over the next decade, that's a totally different story. When we contrast the 2 biggest spenders here, the difference is just staggering. On one side, Google achieved total victory. They turned DoubleClick's ad server into Google Ad Manager and the exchange into AdX. Then, by adding a small buy-side acquisition called Invite Media around 2010, they wired the whole thing into a single stack, controlling the buyer, the seller, and the auction. On the flip side, Microsoft took a complete loss.
By 2012, they had written off essentially the entire $6 billion Aquentive purchase. The ad server withered, and the agency they acquired just created unmanageable conflicts of interest. The fallout from Microsoft was so severe that it took them a decade and a half to find their footing again. They literally didn't get back into the game seriously until 15 years later, when they bought the remains of a platform called Axander from AT&T. That's the asset that actually powers Microsoft's current deal with Netflix today. And a quick shout out to industry analyst Bo for pointing that out, as our author notes. But man, what a long, expensive 15-year detour.
Then we have the incredibly costly failure of the so-called third pole. Both Yahoo, even though they bought the first true programmatic exchange, Right Media, and AOL, who assembled their behavioral networks into Platform A, they both bet they could stand as a real alternative to the emerging Google and Facebook duopoly. And both bets failed. The cost really compounded when Verizon later spent close to $9 billion trying to smash Yahoo and AOL together into a combined entity called Oath. In the end, Verizon only recovered roughly half of that massive investment.
So what about WPP? Well, they had the right problem, but the wrong solution. Martin Sorrell was absolutely right to fear that agencies were vulnerable to getting disintermediated by the big tech platforms. But his solution, owning an ad server, was totally off the mark. The thing that actually ended up mattering most, the thing holding companies are still fighting tooth and nail over today, turned out to be data and identity, not the actual ad-serving pipes.
Which brings us to part 4, why position beats technology.
So the crucial point is, how does all this history actually apply to the digital world that you and I are dealing with today? It's captured beautifully by Natrian Maxwell. He says, almost none of these deals were really about technology. They were about position. This is the most powerful, sticky insight from the entire analysis. It really wasn't about who had the best code. It was all about the strategic real estate they were buying.
Let's unpack that word for a second. Position means where a company sits in the flow of a marketer's dollar, who they depend on, and who they can credibly threaten. The raw technology that these companies bought back in 2007, most of it aged out in about 18 months. But the market position that Google purchased, that lasted for decades. Microsoft and the others mostly just bought technology or they bought a position that they simply couldn't operate.
And that brings us right to our current operating environment. This isn't just history. This is the water we are swimming in right now. When you buy programmatic display today, you're using infrastructure that traces directly back to those 2007 DoubleClick and Right Media decisions. They literally pioneered the modern real-time auction architecture back then. Plus, today's massive retail media networks, where agencies and retailers are going head-to-head over customer data, that's just the second act of the exact same questions WPP was raising in 2007. Only today, retailers hold a trump card nobody had back then: actual verified purchase data. This history also gives us the perfect context to understand what's happening legally right now, specifically the recent Department of Justice monopolization ruling against Google's Adtech business. Our source impartially points out a really profound irony here. The very vertical integration that made the 2007 DoubleClick deal so brilliant from a pure business perspective, wiring the whole stack together, is the exact same thing that the DOJ ultimately ruled made it illegal. So, when you read the headlines about the potential unwinding of Google's ad tech stack in the current remedy phase, you now know exactly what you're looking at. The legal arguments happening right now are quite literally a debate over whether corporate decisions and integrations made during that 90-day window in 2007 and finalized around 2010 should be forcibly reversed by the government today.
Which leaves us with a totally fascinating question to ponder. Will the structural decisions of 2007 finally be reversed, breaking apart the actual pipes of the internet? Or will the new retail media giants simply learn from this history and buy up the next untouchable market position? The author of our source, Natrian Maxwell, promises to do deep dives into each of these 5 companies in the coming weeks. And honestly, understanding this 2007 foundation makes those future stories incredibly compelling. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep learning, keep questioning, and I'll catch you next time.